It's over. America's economy has just slipped into the red as Washington crossed a line never seen before. For the first time in half a century, a former president faces forced isolation by his own system. No delays, no shields, a decision that rewrites the balance of power overnight. How did it come to this? Stay with us, because what happens next changes the rules forever. This story does not begin with anger. It begins with law. The allegations are not new, but their weight has finally become unavoidable. Classified documents that were never returned, a prolonged dispute over election interference, and now, the most dangerous threshold of all, contempt of court triggered by repeated refusal to comply with a lawful order. These are not political talking points. They are active enforcement matters. The stage of debate has ended. The stage of consequences has begun. For months, Donald Trump treated these accusations as irritants, minor paperwork disputes, technicalities beneath his attention. He mocked them openly. He dismissed them privately. He framed them as small, tedious obstacles, unworthy of a man who once commanded the most powerful office on earth. I have covered leaders who bluffed, delayed, and postured before. What I have never seen is a defendant so openly contemptuous of the process designed to restrain him. That contempt collided at last with the Supreme Court. In a ruling delivered without drama and without mercy, the court rejected the final emergency request for delay. No stay, no pause, no political escape hatch. The lower court's order stood intact, and with it, the legal machinery that follows any refusal to obey. From that moment forward, a clock began to tick. 48 hours, not a metaphorical clock, a procedural one. I have reported on constitutional crises before. Even for me, it is difficult to describe the chill that settles when the law stops negotiating and starts enforcing. This was not a loud decision. It did not need to be. Its power came from finality. Then came the signal that something had broken. Late that night, deep inside the White House complex, internal security protocols were activated. Floors were sealed. Access was restricted. No public explanation was offered, only the language of an internal security measure. But make no mistake, this was not routine. This was not a drill. This was containment. It is almost impossible to overstate the gravity of that moment. For the first time in modern American history, a lockdown procedure was applied in response to the actions of a former president. Not a foreign threat, not a terrorist alert, an internal risk. I remember sitting with the initial reports in front of me, rereading them slowly because I genuinely could not believe what I was seeing. I have watched institutions bend. I have watched them strain. I have never seen them turn inward like this. This is not the story of Donald Trump the man. It is the opening chapter of a brutal test of whether American constitutional law can still hold when pushed into territory it was never designed to visit. This is the point where the crisis stops being abstract and becomes operational. The players are no longer symbolic. They are functional. Each one occupies a specific square on a board that has begun to tilt toward enforcement, not persuasion. At the center of it all stands Donald Trump, not as a campaign figure or a political brand, but as a subject of legal compulsion. He is facing the machinery of coercion. He is accused of refusing to recognize binding court instructions. And according to multiple accounts now on record, he has treated those instructions with open disdain, mocking the seriousness of the allegations, reducing them to petty annoyances, and portraying compliance as weakness. I have watched powerful defendants posture before, but even now it is difficult for me to grasp the scale of this contempt. I have never seen someone treat a federal court order as if it were a punchline. Surrounding him is a set of institutions that do not speak loudly but act decisively. First, the lower federal court. This is where the consequences are born. It holds the authority to impose fines that bleed resources, to freeze assets that sustain operations, and if defiance persists, to authorize coercive enforcement. This court does not negotiate. It executes procedure. When deadlines expire, actions follow. Then there is the Department of Justice alongside the FBI. Their posture has shifted. This is no longer observation. This is readiness. Files move from desks to hands. Protocols are reviewed. Lines of responsibility are clarified. When a system reaches this stage, it is because the assumption of voluntary compliance has collapsed. Inside the White House itself, the least visible actors have become the most consequential. The overnight staff, the security supervisors, the procedural officers who do not make policy and do not take sides. They exist for one purpose only: to trigger safeguards when risk crosses a defined threshold. Their decision to activate emergency protocols is evidence, not theater. It is documentation of perceived danger. And finally, the Republican leadership. Their silence is not confusion. It is a calculation. Public loyalty has given way to careful distance. The language has changed. Support has been replaced by respect for the rule of law. I have seen this pivot before, but never this quickly. I will be honest. Even after decades of covering national crises, this alignment is shocking. Politics has stepped back. Law has stepped forward. The board is set. And once that happens, the game no longer waits for consent. The countdown did not begin with panic. It began with a ruling. Early that morning, the Supreme Court closed the final door. The request for an emergency delay was denied, not postponed, not softened, denied. With that single procedural act, the legal order beneath it snapped fully into force. There was no remaining space for bargaining, no procedural air left to breathe. What had once been a legal dispute became an obligation. And obligations, when ignored, do not argue back. They escalate. I have watched many high-stakes rulings land over the years. Even now, it is difficult for me to convey how stark this moment felt. There was no grand language, no moral lecture, no flourish, just finality. And finality is the most dangerous word in law. Within hours, the reaction inside Washington shifted from commentary to containment. A closed-door meeting was convened, not a political meeting, a risk assessment. The questions were blunt and unromantic. Could this individual mobilize supporters in real time? Could he attempt to bypass institutional channels? Could his communications disrupt the chain of command or, worse, fracture it? These were not speculative fears. They were scenarios mapped against precedent, intelligence, and behavior already on record. What emerged from that meeting was a conclusion that still feels surreal to say out loud. This was being treated as an internal security threat. Not foreign, not external, internal. I have covered terrorism alerts. I have covered wartime posture shifts. I have never seen the language of national risk applied inward with this level of seriousness. As the day bled into night, the tone hardened. At precisely 11:45 p.m. Eastern Time, the decision was executed. Sensitive floors were sealed, access points were restricted, communications were narrowed to approved channels only. Armed personnel were deployed, not as a show of force, but as a precaution against unpredictability. This was not theater. This procedure was activated at a point of no return. I remember staring at the timestamp on the report and thinking, I have never seen this. Even for someone who has spent decades watching institutions strain, this crossed into unexplored territory. This was the state protecting itself from someone who once embodied it. Then came the counterstrike. From outside the controlled channels, messages began to appear online. Donald Trump dismissed the legal orders with sarcasm and scorn, treating binding court directives as if they were petty insults. He accused unnamed officials of betrayal. He framed enforcement as persecution. And most dangerously, he urged supporters to surround the building, to make themselves visible, to apply pressure where the law had already spoken. This mattered, not politically, legally. Every such statement compounded the risk of contempt. Every call to defy or disrupt enforcement hardened the case that voluntary compliance was no longer possible. I have seen defendants test limits before. What I have never seen is someone treat the concept of court authority itself as something to be mocked, minimized, waved away like a minor inconvenience. By this point, the machinery of enforcement was no longer hypothetical. The Department of Justice moved into readiness. The U.S. Marshals Service entered standby posture. These are not agencies that posture for television. They prepare quietly, and when deadlines expire, they move. The law, at this stage, becomes automatic. If 48 hours pass without compliance, the next steps are not optional. They are procedural. This is the moment where even seasoned observers feel a tightening in the chest. It is hard, even for me, to accept how fast this escalated. But escalation is what happens when defiance meets a system built to outlast personalities. There was no longer a question of if enforcement would occur. That question died with the denial of the emergency delay. The only questions left were when, how, and how much force would be required to preserve order. That is the true terror of this chapter. When a constitutional system stops persuading and starts executing its rules, history accelerates. And once it does, no amount of mockery, bravado, or political theater can slow the clock back down. The countdown was no longer rhetorical. It was real. The first shock did not come from a speech or a courtroom. It came from the markets. As the legal standoff hardened, futures dropped sharply, not gradually, not cautiously. They fell as if a floor had given way. The US dollar came under immediate pressure, and gold surged as investors fled towards safety. These are not emotional reactions. They are mechanical responses to institutional stress. Markets do not care about loyalty or ideology. They care about stability, and stability was suddenly in question. I have covered financial crises before, but even now it is difficult for me to process how fast confidence evaporated. This was not a rumor-driven dip. This was a repricing of risk tied directly to a constitutional rupture. When enforcement replaces negotiation at the top of the system, capital moves first and asks questions later, and then the damage reaches the public. Interest rates begin to climb. That is not theory. That is math. Mortgage payments rise. Credit card balances become more expensive. Auto loans tighten. For millions of households, this means fewer choices and harder trade-offs. Businesses respond in predictable ways. Hiring is paused. Expansion plans are shelved. Shifts are shortened. Hours are cut. Income disappears quietly, one paycheck at a time. I want to be very clear about this. A constitutional crisis is not an abstract concept debated by lawyers in Washington. It goes straight into the wallets of ordinary people. It shows up at the grocery store. It shows up in monthly bills. It shows up in the anxiety of workers who sense, correctly, that something fundamental is breaking above them. Internationally, the consequences widen. Allies begin to hesitate. Decision-making reliability comes into question. Trade talks are slow. Security consultations are quietly postponed, and adversarial media seize the moment, broadcasting images of American instability as proof of systemic decay. I have watched this playbook before. Once doubt takes hold, it spreads faster than reassurance. At home, the political damage compounds the economic one. The MAGA base shows visible fractures, not rebellion, fatigue. Donors pull back, not out of outrage, but out of calculation. Republican leadership shifts into survival mode, replacing defiance with careful distance. The language changes because the risk has changed. Self-preservation overtakes solidarity. What makes this moment so unsettling, even for someone like me who has seen many crises, is the casual contempt that helped trigger it. The repeated mocking of court orders, the dismissal of charges as trivial, the suggestion that consequences were beneath consideration. That posture did not shield anyone. It accelerated collapse. This is the point where denial becomes expensive, and the bill, as always, is sent to the public first. History does not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in procedure, stamped with dates and deadlines. This is one of those moments. A line has been crossed, and there is no undoing it. For the first time in modern American history, a former president has been treated not as a political figure, not as a symbol, but as a risk to be managed. He can be isolated. He can be controlled. He can be compelled by the very system that once existed to protect him. That is not speculation. That is precedent. And precedents once established do not politely disappear. I will admit this openly. Even after decades of watching power bend and snap, I never thought I would see this. I have covered resignations, impeachments, wars, and market collapses. I have never seen the machinery of American government turn inward with such precision, such finality. This is unexplored territory. And when institutions enter unexplored territory, mistakes become expensive very quickly. From this point forward, there are only three paths left. The first is compliance. Orders are followed, tension eases. But the cost is reputational ruin. Authority, once mocked and dismissed as trivial, cannot be reclaimed simply by yielding at the last minute. The damage would be permanent. The second path is defiance. Continued refusal would trigger formal contempt proceedings and coercive enforcement. That road leads to penalties, restrictions, and actions that no democracy prefers to take against someone who once led it, but may be forced to take anyway. The third path is confrontation, public escalation, mass pressure, institutional strain. That is the most dangerous option of all, because when confrontation replaces process, instability spreads outward. Markets react, allies hesitate, and ordinary citizens absorb the shock. This is why the moral verdict matters. This is not about whether Donald Trump wins or loses. That framing is a distraction. The real question is far colder and far more serious. Can the rule of law still shield the public from the chaos that follows unchecked power? Or has the system been pushed to the edge of its own endurance? What makes this moment so corrosive is the posture that preceded it. The mockery, the sarcasm, the open scorn for binding court orders, treated as minor inconveniences, as beneath attention. That contempt did not weaken the charges. It strengthened them. It did not buy time. It destroyed it. When the White House is forced to seal its own floors to preserve order, the first thing on trial is not a man. It is the resilience of a democratic system under maximum stress. And the final truth is this: when institutions fracture, the consequences do not stay in Washington. They land in household budgets. They land in lost hours of work. They land in rising costs and shrinking confidence. The bill always comes due, and it is never sent to the powerful first. Thank you for staying with me until these final moments. It truly means a great deal. If this story touched you or sparked reflection, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share so our voices can reach further. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you on the next journey. Farewell.